appreciate the work that John put into organizing this. It's not every day as an educator that someone comes to you and says, hey, can I take something that would be really useful for your class and do all the work, and so I really do appreciate that John pulled the panel together and organized all this. It works out at a perfect time in our class, and I'm glad to have everyone else join in on this. I'm just going to ask panelists some questions, and I'll be monitoring the chat as things come through, and maybe we'll try to work some questions in along the way, and otherwise we're going to try to save some time at the end. The first question that we'd like to ask our panelists is what is your background in food sustainability? And I don't know what order we want to run into. I can run in the order that you appear. Starr, would you like to take this one, this first one?
Sure. So I'm Starr Brainard, she, her pronouns. I've been the Duluth Community Garden Program's Land Stewardship Coordinator for the past 4 years now. I'm also the president of the Duluth Young Farmers Coalition. I run a small urban farm here in town. My background's environmental studies, and I've also done some research on small-scale sustainable farming systems in Canada and worked at a Sustainable Research Institute in Cairo, Egypt.
Okay, thank you. Professor de Souza.
Sure. Again, thank you for having me. So my work intersects with sustainability in sort of a roundabout way. I study hunger and food insecurity in the United States. And one of the things I do as a communication professor is that I study negative meanings that surround people who are hungry and food insecure. And we call that stigma. And one of the things that I found out in my research is that stigma is essentially linked to the structure and the system that we've set up to distribute food in the United States today. And what some food theorists and activists call it, they say, we have a two-tier food system, one for the rich and one for the poor. And what happens is, where does that second tier of the food system comes from? Well, it comes from what we call food waste. And that's sort of my intersection with sustainability and food system sustainability, because what's happening every year is that, we've got millions of tons of food that is going to waste. And that's typically what we call industrial surplus food. And then that food is gathered and collected and salvaged and then distributed to people who are hungry and food insecure through the charitable food banking system. So things like food pantries and soup kitchens and other sort of meal distribution systems. It's not the best food, it's industrial processed food, and that's where you got sort of that negative meaning and negative value attached to people who are hungry and food insecure. And it's all hanging on this idea that we're wasting so much food, so let's just salvage it and give it to people who are hungry. And my argument is that, food waste and hunger are two separate problems that need different solutions. And we shouldn't be using food waste to solve the problem of hunger, because it's an incredibly stigmatizing way in which to treat human beings and in which they can receive their food. So I'll stop there and then we can have continue the conversation.
Okay, thank you. Dan?
Yeah, I guess I would say I'm with my farmer hat on, I'm kind of on the front lines of the background in food sustainability. And sustainability to me extends beyond kind of the environmental sustainability. It also has to be economically sustainable. So not only for farms, but also the communities that farmers are living in, so that they have the resources they need to be successful. So, being environmentally sustainable is just one aspect of it. But if you're a farmer and you're not making a profit, but you are environmentally sustainable, your farm is not going to last very long. And so your impact is going to be short-lived on the world. So that actually intersects well with my work at SFA. And so I'm community organizing in sort of the south central and southwestern part of the state. And we're organizing around local foods as a way to bring not only environmental sustainability, but economic sustainability to farms and farmers in my working region. So I think I'll leave it there.
Okay. Thanks, Dan. And Professor Bertossi.
I came to study food systems in kind of a very roundabout way. My family comes from the mountains of West Virginia, and we suffered generations of poverty and food insecurity ourselves. So I always grew up with this story of people being pushed from the mountains due to the mining companies and having eaten everything on the mountains before they left. And so I was really interested more in, I wasn't interested at all in getting into agriculture. It just seemed like more poverty to me. And that was because my mom sometimes worked picking green beans and apples to make a living, and we got our food from dumpsters or the government. And I grew up on food stamps my whole life. I kind of got involved more in a conservation sort of a academic pathway, influenced by some of the problems associated with both poverty and destruction of land. And so I've always been really interested in that. But I did co-operate with my partner a small organic farm because when I met him, he had one. So that was for about 10 years before getting my PhD in in sustainability, where I've since studied resilience and kind of looking at not just academia and experts for answers, but respecting people, people's knowledge systems of all sorts. So then when I saw this position open at UMD, there was a new kind of mission for the land lab, and it included food access, and it also included ecology and ecological systems. And so that's kind of how I got into studying food systems. And so it's really an interdisciplinary approach and being really sensitive both to farmer livelihoods, but the need to break down barriers to good food, and relating to what Rebecca said, that experience of trying to get food when you don't have enough food and how uncomfortable and embarrassing that can be certainly is woven into how I approach food systems. So thanks for having me.
Well, thank you all for sharing those stories. We can try to expand on some of those, some of the things that you all alluded to. So the next question, what do sustainable food systems look like on a local scale, and what do they look like on a global scale? And I would add, is there anything necessarily different between looking at those different scales? Is there anyone that would like to jump in on that first? Okay.
I'll jump in. So I think the pandemic kind of highlighted some of the problems of the global or at least national scale food systems. I mean, we all heard about the meatpacking plants shutting down and their workers getting sick at disproportionate numbers to general population and those kinds of things. It really kind of underscored the the flaws, I guess, in the I'm going to call it the industrial food system. And so there's no reason that that can't happen again in our lifetimes. There could be another pandemic, there could be other issues, and so a decentralized food system that's focused around sort of many smaller producers and the supporting industries. So think like butcher shops for meat producers, maybe smaller canning companies for vegetable producers, and so on. The problem is scale, right? The reason that these companies got so big and got so centralized is because they could sell a steak or a can of green beans at a way lower price. And so how do we compete with that? And I mean, the short answer is if everybody wants to be profitable, and I should say that when I say the word profit, I don't mean that, you're like sitting on a pile of money and just like rich. What I'm talking about is that you're able to pay your employees, you're able to pay yourself a reasonable wage, and you're able to invest a little bit back into your business every year. I'm not talking about everybody getting really rich off of small scale food systems, just, enough to survive comfortably. And so how do you produce local food at a price that is sort of sustainable for everybody. And I think it probably requires some kind of like culture shift in the value of food, because this country is basically, as long as I've been alive, which admittedly is not super duper long, it's all been about the cheapest food you could get. You know, it's like, oh, these steaks are, you know, $4.99 a pound or whatever. This is a really great deal. And then, you know, the next guy comes along and it's, you know, $4.50 a pound, and on and on and on, a race to the bottom on cheap, not very good for you food.
All right. Thanks, Dan.
I might elaborate on that a tiny bit. I'd say I completely agree, and I think that the local and global system are definitely, you can't really separate them, but basically, I guess I agree with Dan. I would say that the way to save the global food system is to localize it more and have stronger, you know, regionally resilient food systems that support farmers that produce good food. And an interesting conversation that's come up with some, you know, both in my sort of nonprofit work and also in my farmer relation work, is kind of the question of like, should food even be like commoditized? Because it's the conflict of, we want our farmers paid fairly, and we want them to have a quality product, and we want them to be paid the value of that product. But on the other side, you know, asking someone poor to like, you really need to pay more for this food is a little bit like, if people are hungry, they're going to go for the cheapest food so they can eat more of it. So that conflict seems to go fundamentally against some like two levels of sort of basic human rights, like having a basic livelihood and having basic nutrition. So something that, you know, we've even talked about is, you know, should food even be on the like capitalist market? Like, should it be subsidized, or should it be the sort of basic human right level? Which is complicated, because as a farmer, like, that is my business. But I think it's complicated and interesting to think about.
And I'd to add to that, just coming at it from a slightly different angle, I think I agree with what the panelists have said so far, that, you know, local and global food systems are interconnected. I'm originally from India, and that's why I grew up. And one of the things that got me into studying hunger and food insecurity in the US was actually the problem of not just hunger in India and in the developing world, but also the ways in which we have, you know, trade agreements that sort of reinforce that hunger, and that reinforce not just food, but also access to grain. Farmers are killing themselves right now. It's a huge epidemic in India, farmer suicide. At about 100, you know, something like 100 farmers a day are killing themselves because of indebtedness to large agro industries who are supplying them with the industrial inputs for their agriculture, but then they're not able to repay. So I do think they're connected. So, you know, I sort of have that lens, but then you come to a country like the United States, which is supposedly a country of abundance, and you find that 50 million people are also hungry and food insecure in this country, and also added to that, farmers too. Right, and it's been in the news, you know, for the last 5 years, that farmers who are growing food because they're not growing food that they can eat are also experiencing hunger and food insecurity. And there is a deep connection, because these are the same, you know, 10 industries that control basically the food systems of the world, the primary and the mainstream food systems. So I think that needs some kind of an intervention to sort of fix that system. The other thing that I wanted to add to this is that, on the one hand, people want cheap food, and I think you're absolutely right, Starr, that it's linked to people's inability to access food in any way and not having the resources. I did a study, and this is really where my research sort of comes from, and, you know, my arguments. But I did a study in Duluth over the last, you know, it's been going on for about 10 years. But basically, I interviewed people who use food pantries. And we have a ton of interviews talking to people who are poor, who lack access to food, and so are using food pantries. And one of the things that they talk about, which I think may be hopeful, is that there is this immense distrust of industrial food. And this is something I think mainstream, you know, society does not know about. We think about poor people as eating bad food and being happy with it, right? They're the so-called food dupes, just duped by by these big agro-industrial corporations, but that's not true at all. I mean, people talk about not trusting the food that they're getting that is packaged. They talk about the importance of knowing where your food comes from and seeing it come up from the earth, and having more trust in the land and having more trust in the ground and the dirt and the soil than in corporations. And they talked about wanting to grow their own food, and this was surprising to me. I do not want to be in the dirt and growing my own food, but people did, right? I mean, people did. And for a lot of people in Duluth also, I think because we're sort of in this weird urban-rural kind of juncture, they had a lot of experience growing their own food and had done it in the past and had grown up growing their own food, but now simply lacked access to land. Some were also living in renting apartments or living with other people, and so there was just no space. So when we think about, decentralized food system, that's something else that we have to consider. I mean, it doesn't come up to scale, and that's the problem with, growing your own food. But that's one of those pieces in which to decenter the food system, where we actually somehow subsidize land for people so that they're able to grow food if they want to and if they choose to. The other thing I want to bring in here is that, people of color and minorities suffer from hunger and food insecurity at disproportionate rates from the mainstream population. So if you look at the numbers, it's something like 9 or 10% of white people experience hunger and food insecurity, and that number goes to like 25, 30% for Black or African American and Hispanic populations. That number goes to about 60%, in some cases as high as 60 and 70% for American Indian, Alaska Native populations. So it is a question of food justice. It is also a question of racial justice, and those two things are so interconnected. And that's something also to consider when we're talking about decentering the food system. How do we make sure that how do we make sure that everybody has access and no one is now disproportionately left out of that decentering, right? So when we talk about farmers, the USDA has this long history, ongoing history of being absolutely racist, right, towards Black farmers, taking away their land, not giving them loans for land. And that's going on today. So how do we keep that in mind as we try to construct a new and better food system moving forward?
Just to build off what Rebecca said quick on the super micro scale people growing their own food, I work with the Duluth Community Garden Program. And so we have 20 different sites across the city, and about 200 gardeners or gardener families. And I want to say about a third of our gardeners are in the low income bracket. We offer plots on a sliding fee scale. So people basically pay what they can. We just have sort of the suggested price for wherever their income falls. And it's definitely very rewarding seeing people growing their own food. And, a lot of people who are on the lower income scale are just as good at it, just as passionate about growing organic, just as invested in soil health. But something we're trying to address lately is we've been thinking about okay, so we want to provide this land for people, but it's not just about having the resource of land, it's also about having the resource of time to grow your own food. So we're trying to start a program this next year that will have giving gardens. So we're actually hiring a staff person who will take care of plots that are there for free taking of food, just as for the public to have access to it. And so hopefully, that will help the people who have too much insecurity to they can't reliably take care of a garden for a whole plot. So that's one of the small ways we're trying to address that. But it is, it's complicated. It's hard to make the time. A garden is a commitment. And, sometimes deer come in or, just people come in and sometimes just trash the gardens. And it's sad when people need to eat that food. But yeah, whoever else wants to talk.
Teresa, did you want to jump in?
Sure. From my perspective, so I first worked in natural resources for a while, and just this idea that about 40% of our land is occupied by agriculture across the globe, and that social injustices are closely tied to degradation of land. And I think, too, one thing I've come to realize is that a lot of the dominant Western perspectives of sustainability have left a lot of people out of the story, and are embedded in those histories of colonialism and loss of land, and that's a global issue, and an issue our food systems in the United States are built on those same stories of degradation of land and people. I don't think we have an answer for what I teach sustainable food systems, and my students hate it, but I don't think we have an answer yet of what that looks like. I think we have to be mindful of the past and of innovative ideas that might come from people we don't think are necessarily experts or that we respect their knowledge. And so this panel is great to bring, more people, more disciplines, more interdisciplinary perspectives, but we also need to be, have polycentric governance where people who are affected are closely involved in making these solutions. And they're going to be different geographically speaking, for everyone, but globally we can share ideas and learn from each other. So I guess I agree with most of you that we need to relocalize food systems, but we need to and make sure people can have a livelihood. But I think we really have to look at livelihood from a new way, whereas we have a tendency to divide the planet into the less developed and the most developed, and respect goes mostly to the most developed, where gross domestic product is honored, right? But there are some economies still intact in some places, like Inner Mongolian peoples who have land, or some indigenous communities who still have the food they need and a livelihood that makes sense for them. So I'm not sure if I completely answered the question you asked, but that's, I guess, why I ended up with a PhD in sustainability, because I just couldn't find one discipline that looked at this complex system and and the need to be innovative. And one thing I can say coming from poverty is that some of the best ideas really are in places where people have been pushed to their limit and had no other way but to come up with their own creative solution. And I think it's a matter of the experts, and I respect expertise in science and academia, but I think we have to do a better job of honoring and including, being more inclusive, so that we can come up with innovative solutions to these complex problems we face. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question we were going to touch on, I think many of you have already addressed, and that is, what are some of the problems? What are some of the barriers of getting from where we are to where we say we'd like to be? One of the things that we've talked about a lot in our course has been that if we'd like to get to more decentralized food systems, we're up against this system that values commodity crops and feedlot produced beef and pork, and most of the subsidies are going to the large corporations. And how could we possibly break this cycle? And this is something that my students ask me repeatedly, and I would very curious to hear what you all might say about how we can break that cycle. I realize that's a tall order.
I'll take a stab at it, just because I think about it a lot as a small produce grower. I mean, it's 2 acres, right? So we're super duper small. We sell at a farmer's market. We have a CSA program. We sell a little bit of stuff to our local food co-op. So it's like hyper local, if you will. 90% of the dollars that we have that come in are within like 30 miles of where we live. So hyper local. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about, well, how do you tackle that? And the only solution that I think I've come up with is that we need to educate our customers about the value that our products have. Actually, let me. So the value that our products have, but one other thing that I thought about too is the actual like hidden value or hidden costs inside some of like the industrial produced food that don't get assigned like a dollar value essentially. So I'm going to pick on the meat packing industry because it's a pretty easy example. But there's like some social injustices happening there, and that got highlighted with the pandemic because we had, like I was saying before, there's a disproportionate amount of those workers who fell ill to COVID-19, who passed away from COVID-19. And there was even this really terrible story about how like Tyson executives were betting on how many employees would contract COVID or something like that, like cash bets from the exec. It was horrible, absolutely horrible, right? And so there's a hidden cost, right? Yeah, you're able to produce like a $2 pork chop or whatever, but what is the value? What is the value of the people behind that that didn't get accounted for? And then we can talk about environmental values too, right? Because we have these large feedlot systems where we have literal manure lagoons, right? So it's like a lagoon of animal feces that's collected because there's so much waste that they can't deal with it because it's such a large scale, right? And so they're horribly smelly. They pump them out I think twice a year in the spring and the fall. And then there's these huge fertilizer spreaders or manure spreaders that go around and spread out this manure. But this system is not environmentally sustainable. There's tons of stories of when we have crazy rainfalls where these systems leak into nearby streams and pollute everything downriver. And so with climate change, these heavy rainfall events are happening more frequently. And so like you can see how this system and these hidden costs that don't get accounted for, sort of yield this really cheap food, but at a really high cost to sort of society, I guess. And so how do you account for that cost? Because if you could account for those costs, I think the local producers would probably fare better, competing with these producers. It'd probably be the same price, actually. We might even be cheaper than the big guys if they had to pay for some of the environmental and social damage that they're causing.
Thanks, Dan.
I can add a little bit to that. I think there's a lot of little ways to like chip away at the flaws in the food system. But I think to make the sort of wide scale shift we really need, I think there probably needs to be some pretty major intervention. And one of the things that, I'm not speaking for any more my organizations or anything, but my perspective is that subsidies for commodity crops are deeply problematic. It's, putting tons and tons of money and tons of land into crops that could be food crops, but are maybe just going to, ethanol, a fuel that nobody wants anyway, or going into like feedlot food, when we could be growing those animals on rotationally grazed grass and restoring the ecosystem anyway. I mean, subsidizing I'm trying to just like starch products to then ship abroad. That doesn't make any sense. And if we really want to help small local farmers and feed people nutritious food, the small local farmers should be getting those subsidies. So the system isn't even stable in the way it exists right now. It's propped up through these artificial mechanisms. So I think that's a huge one. And I would be curious to see if the food system would, right itself, even if you just took out the subsidies that aren't helping, and then see, maybe those small farmers would even outcompete naturally, if you will, in like the free market setting. I think another interesting one is like if we're talking about really localizing food systems on the sort of extreme level. I mean, we're in northern Minnesota. If we really wanted a localized food system, our diet's going to have to be different. If we're really thinking local on that sort of extreme way, we're not going to have tomatoes in winter. There is a lot of food we can have, and there's lots of things that we can do through like canning and things like that. But living off mangoes and avocados probably is not going to happen here. And I think there's a lot of Americans who aren't really willing to make that sacrifice. A few thoughts, that's all.
I want to add to what Starr said, particularly about the subsidies. I'm of the mind that, no amount or no more technology is going to help us through this problem. The problem is political, and so the solution is also political. And political means it has to do with people, because it's people basically making decisions based on their values and beliefs. And a big part of that solution is in the Farm Bill, and that's what Starr was talking about. And the Farm Bill is basically where you have solutions for hunger and solutions for agriculture tied together. And you can think of it sort of as a urban-rural handshake. We'll look after you're hungry and you're poor in the cities if you give us subsidies to the crops that we grow. And so those two things are politically tied together in the Farm Bill, which is, I think, hugely problematic. So we actually just recently, in the last week, lost a big opportunity to disrupt that relationship. I don't know if you've been listening to the news, but Biden was going to pick, one of the people he was going to pick as director of the USDA was Representative Marsha Fudge. She's an African-American woman, and the idea was that she was going to maybe disrupt that relationship and pay more attention to hunger and nutrition in people. But it didn't go that way, and he's picked the same guy who was director under Obama, Vilsack. And that just maintains status quo. But you're right that, the commodities are absolutely subsidizing what everybody likes to think is a free market, but actually isn't, because it's subsidizing agriculture at a heavy rate. And if you look at the numbers, actually, the USDA doesn't subsidize fruits and vegetables, barely. Organic food, it's something like 2% or less. Everything else is for industrial, for your commodities. So, and that's hugely problematic. So, if you want to think about, a large-scale solution, it's a political one, and it's tied to the Farm Bill, and we need to find ways in which to disrupt that and advocate. But many people, it's a 1,000-page document. So it's even really hard for activists and advocates to read and to sort of make sense of. But that's, I think, a big part of the solution lies in there.
Teresa, anything you want to add there?
I agree with the challenges of the Farm Bill, and I've been talking to smallholder farmers in the Northland about their perspectives on what that needs to look like, and I think we missed the boat as well with Biden's choice. But again, I keep coming back to, in my own research, is a real need for local communities to, which would include the farmers, the rural people and urban people, to be able to work together, rather than, there's been a tendency in the environmental field, and I'd say even in social economic assistance, to have this really centralized approach to the solutions. And if we're going to get to the solutions, these subsidies that you're talking about could be going to people who have already begun to fix those problems in their communities. They just aren't the ones being subsidized. And so I tried for my PhD research to travel to communities, especially vanishing communities. I started rural places, as people get pushed to urban centers. And I started there just talking to people. What are your solutions? What are your ideas? What are you already doing? And people are doing really remarkable things already, and they need those subsidies. And so if those subsidies were redirected, I think we would all be willing to, it would be less of a shock when we see our paychecks if we knew those tax dollars were going to things, that were benefiting us. But this centralized approach, both to common property resources and socioeconomic fixes, are a real problem. There are really great examples. As a kid, I remember there was a program for just a little while where my mom got a job working at a park, and she felt so proud that she was able to get a job. She only had a 6th grade education and, no teeth. A single mom with 6 kids was able to get this job, and she was really proud. And Rebecca mentioned the stigma of both local knowledge systems and, people who don't have work, or, rural people, or even inner city poor people. So again, I think I was looking, there's this study called the handmade urbanism. It's a really interesting study where the planners go into squatter settlements across the globe and they interview people, and then they take the solutions that those people have identified up to the people at the top, who the expert planners in the cities. And it was a really interesting study. And it's complicated to try to do it. I can speak from experience trying to do that. And it's a lot of work, but that's where, that's, I think, where the change is going to happen.
Okay, thank you. So we've identified some, okay, go ahead, Dan.
Can I add something? I want to talk a little bit more about the Farm Bill. And I want to start by saying that I agree that the Farm Bill and some of the insurance subsidies need to be reworked. But I want to talk about the actual spending of the Farm Bill. And if you break that down, and 3/4, or roughly 3/4 of spending in the Farm Bill goes towards nutrition. So that's like SNAP, EBT, and those kinds of things. So of all of the money that they allocate to the Farm Bill, I don't know how many dollars it is off the top of my head, but 3/4 of those dollars goes towards nutrition. And of that, the subsidy piece of it is something like, hold on, I pulled it up here. It is, so 663 billion with a B goes towards nutrition, and 77.9 billion goes towards insurance subsidies. And so when we talk about subsidizing farmers in the Farm Bill, what we're actually subsidizing is crop insurance for farmers. And admittedly, the crop insurance system my dad farms corn and soybeans, so I have a pretty close relationship with this stuff, and this has been kind of fundamental to why I'm here today. But the insurance subsidy system is broken because it takes the risk of producing corn and soybeans out of sort of conventional farmers. And even my dad, who is, I don't know, he's a traditional farmer, we'll say that, is for having some kind of reform to the insurance program that makes it risky for farmers, more risky for farmers to produce corn and soybeans. So that's why we see so much corn and soybeans, at least in southern Minnesota. Other things that go into the Farm Bill include conservation. So NRCS, the National Resource Conservation Service, that's something like $60 billion. So when we talk about the Farm Bill, it gets a lot of really negative, oh, the Farm Bill is the worst thing ever. And it's not, it's not perfect, but the majority of the funding is SNAP. And are there problems with SNAP? Oh yeah, absolutely. But we should keep that in mind when we talk about the Farm Bill, because it's definitely not the silver bullet that we want it to be to fix farming in Minnesota, or in the country.
I just want to add one more sort of minor clarification. So absolutely. So the Farm Bill, a major chunk of that is nutritional assistance, and a major part of that is SNAP benefits. But even the way in which nutritional assistance occurs subsidizes the subsidizes agriculture, right? And industrial agriculture. If you think about TFAP, right? And those are basically, the TFAP is what Feeding America does, basically. And that is where the government will subsidize crops, so as to keep market prices stable. And then buy back, in case there's a market glut, they buy back those crops or that product from farmers. And what happens to that product? Well, it goes down the food pantry line, and it goes down the charitable food system through Feeding America. So part of that nutritional assistance is also tied to industrial surplus in order to keep markets stable, right? And that is a really important function of government. And this is the other piece to keep in mind. The USDA came about after the Great Depression, and one of the things that was happening then was starvation, right? And so there was this huge impetus to subsidize and to help farmers at the time, and also a huge impetus for industrial agriculture, because that was the way in which you guaranteed that you always had grain, right? And that there was a surplus because you wanted that. And so that was the moment when all of these different agreements and the Farm Bill was sort of formulated. It was done with a view of the Great Depression and starvation, and avoiding that in the future, making sure that industrial agriculture would always produce enough and abundant food for everyone. But I think we're at a different time now, and that needs to shift in some ways, keeping in mind that the system as it is not working. And part of that lies with the Farm Bill, and part of that is just also people.
Thank you all for your perspectives there. I do want to remind everyone to please put your questions in the chat, and I'll try to work those in as we can. In the meantime, I want to spin things around a little bit as we're winding down on time. We've talked about a lot of the challenges that are facing us, but what about things that are really positive? What are some things that get you excited? I know a few years ago, David Montgomery came and talked at UMD, and that was uplifting. Some of the things that he was talking about, farmers around the world being able to raise their profits and improve the soil and improve environmental conditions. And I went and read his book immediately, and it's the most positive thing I've read in years. Are there other things that get you excited about the future of sustainable food?
I'll chime in there. I would say, like, the individuals on the ground, like my farm friends working in regenerative agriculture, and just the small businesses they're able to run, the beautiful food products they're able to produce, the innovative ways innovative ways they've gotten food to people, especially like during the pandemic. The cool ways they're restoring soil after really intense harmful practices. And I'd also say, even my gardeners in the Duluth Community Garden Program, they grow awesome things that I couldn't do. There's so much experience on the ground. There's so many cool people out there growing cool things who get a lot of rewards out of this. There's a lot of cool bugs out there. Nature, that was logical in my head. Like the nature on the ground, the people on the ground, the farmers on the ground, on like the micro scale, I think there's a lot of hope. I can get kind of bogged down, a little bit stressed out when you like scope out bigger, but if you look at like the individuals doing the stuff, it's super inspiring, super beautiful, really great to be around.
Thanks, Starr.
I would agree with what Starr said. When I look at what we're doing around Mankato and my, colleague farmers, we're doing some pretty cool stuff. And between the other farmers in the area, you almost don't have to step foot in a grocery store. Like between all of us, we can get everything that you would need for your kitchen. And that's kind of exciting that instead of having to rely on the grocery store, which I think some confidence in that was maybe shaken because of the pandemic, it's nice to know that Yeah, I know a guy that grows wheat and has his wheat milled into flour, and I can go buy flour from him. And I know a person that raises dairy cattle, and so I can go get whole milk from her. And I know somebody that raises pastured pigs, and I can get pigs from them. My dad raises cows. I can get beef from them, and I raise produce. If I can enough of it and freeze enough of it, I don't have to worry about food. Like it's not a, and so that to me is super exciting. And I think it's, I don't know, it's cool because if you put a little bit of time into it to find your farmers, if you will, you know, you can eat locally all and seasonally all year round. And it's, I don't know, it's a great way to eat in my opinion.
Yeah, I guess I would just second all of that and add that, you know, there's, and this is from my research, right? I mean, there's great joy in food. I mean, and this is even for people who are hungry and food insecure. You know, people talk about stretching food and using all of these different strategies to make ends meet and using fillers in food and eating bad food sometimes, but there's still great joy in food, in cooking. People are all foodies, I mean, at this point. Whether you come from, you know, a lot of money, you come from no money, or you're low income, I mean, everybody's a foodie. Everybody's trying to do, you know, make tomato bisque soup with the little that they have, and take great pride and joy in that. And I think that's amazing because it kind of reminds us that food is more than just its chemical components. Food is more than just nutrition, and that's the other problem with how we talk about food systems, right? It's always about, you know, oh, are you getting the right nutrition? No, food is about culture. It's about community. It's about emotion. It's about it's about a birthday celebration. It's about a birthday cake. It's about having treats sometime. We show our love through food. We identify through food as well, who we are. It says a lot about us. And I think all of that speaks to this idea that we need to keep that in mind, that food is not just something we use to get rid of that feeling in our bellies, but there is culture and emotion and great joy in food. And we've got to work for that joy, you know, and to keep it and to sustain it for all of us.
And
ahead,
I'll just add to that about, you know, food really, students in food-based classes can relate to food. And it's been really cool. The Land Lab is a challenge, but it's actually a great teaching tool because it's very practice-based. And I've seen students go in the direction of helping to supply food to, you know, marginalized communities, and then others fly in the direction of trying to address the varroa mite in beehives. And they just latch onto a passion. You know, I try to teach with a connected learning model, and then, you know, it's just a place where, you know, students, I see them really come alive and find a passion and go in that direction. One student's growing mushrooms, you know, and then they want to now become a biologist, but they didn't know they could do science. And you know, so I think it's really added a level of education that excites me. And additionally, a level where the community has come and said, you know, I never really heard much about UMD. And, you know, we need this thing, including local farmers who have come, and we have this challenge and we need help with it. And so it's added a practice for students to academia, a practice-based approach to learning, and also for the community to relate to the university and to have a place to come to for solutions and ideas and help. So that's really exciting for me. Yeah. The very last thing I wanted to add was an article that recently came out where farmers are starting to challenge these, you know, farmers markets and CSAs, which I was a part of for 10 years, and that, you know, that they aren't necessarily the answers, and that there are other ways to address food systems challenges where farmers can make a living instead of paying big bucks to be part of a farmer's market. And so I'm excited to see farmers starting to challenge some of those conventional approaches for organic food and local food distribution.
Okay, thanks everyone. I know some of our students need to move on to other classes, and I But want to finish up on a couple of things as for people that can hang around. Sam asked the question where people can find out more about local farmers, where to buy their products, and Starr put some resources in the chat, including Minnesota Grown, and I think that's great. But I know that's something that some of my students have asked over the course of the last few weeks of how can we do this? How can we find some of these places that Dan was talking about? How can we help support some of those alternatives that Teresa was alluding to? So if any of you have any other resources you'd like to share about how people that want to find ways to support our local farmers might be able to.
I think it does take a little bit extra effort, which is definitely where a lot of us local farmers fall short, where you just can't be as convenient as the convenience store. But there are a lot more resources. There's like Minnesota Grown. There's several different directories. I think but Regenerative Ag has a map of regenerative farms. There's the Open Food Network has a map of farms. I know that like Clyde Ironworks, not this year because things are weird, but they do have like an annual CSA event where they have a whole bunch of local CSA farms show up for one evening and like table. And of course, there's the Edmund Grown website. So there are resources to help you get connected. I also put a link in there for the Duluth Young Farmers Coalition annual meeting we're having tomorrow. But also, you know, there's that organization has a Facebook group following the Sustainable Farming Association. Dan can speak more to that. It's a little bit more legwork, but there are a lot of resources to get people connected.
Great. Thanks, Starr.
The other thing I would add, that everything Starr said is spot on. But the one other thing I would add is if you go to a farmer's market and you're looking for a thing, just go ask a farmer there. If there's a farmer selling produce and you're looking for beef, just be like, hey, do you know anybody that sells beef? Usually farmers at farmers markets are connected and sort of friends with each other, or at least acquaintances. And we will, I mean, almost inevitably point people to, well, you know, I don't grow cattle or I don't raise cattle, but, you know, so-and-so does. Go talk to them. I think they have some beef for sale. And even if there's two vegetable people and, you know, you come up to somebody and you're like, oh, I was really looking for cilantro, but I don't see that you have it. Even the produce people will point you to another produce person and say, well, no, I don't have cilantro today, but I think this other person does. Go see if they have it. And so then you can get connected with all these different farms that way. Like we really are in, we all do better when we all do better. That's the mentality, at least at the Mankato Farmers Market. And so we point each other in the right direction for all of that stuff. So.
Okay, well, sadly, our time is coming to an end rapidly. I really want to thank all four of our panelists for sharing their time and their expertise with us. I thought it was a really great discussion. And again, thanks to John for pulling this together. I'm very appreciative.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.